Welcome back, everybody, to part 3 of my reaction series to Extra History's study of the 100 Years' War. Hope you guys have been enjoying this as much as I have so far. If you didn't see the first 2 episodes of my reaction, the link's in the description, as is the original content of this 3rd video. Before we dive into today's video, I want to take a look real quick at the familial relationships that are behind the 100 Years' War. And there's a French family tree that shows it pretty clearly what's going on here. So let's take a look at that. So it all begins here with King Philip III of France, who reigned from 1270 to 1285. He has 2 sons that we're concerned with. Philip IV, who was on the throne for nearly 30 years, up to 1314. And then his son Charles of Valois, who is going to come in much later in the picture. So Philip IV had 3 sons and a daughter who are of concern to us here. The 3 sons are Louis, Philip, and Charles, and they all successively reigned over France. Louis X for 2 years, Philip V for 6 years, then Charles IV for 6 years. Their sister Isabella is the Isabella who was married to Edward II and who had usurped the crown of England for a time with her lover Roger Mortimer. Isabella is the mother of Edward III, who's the King of England in the 100 Years' War. Now, when Charles IV dies in 1328, this is when Edward III claims the throne as the next, the senior-most living descendant of King Philip IV, which he is. Charles of Valois, his great-uncle, then is going to claim the throne as the senior surviving male line heir of Philip III, since he's arguing that the crown can't pass through a daughter, Isabella, to Edward III. So that's where you have the conflict. Charles of Valois, though, had died in 1325, so it was his son, Philip, who is at war with Edward III over who has the right to be the King of France. Now, interestingly, Philip's sister, Joan, had a daughter, Philippa of Hainaut, who is married to Edward III. So you see, once again, Edward III, he's married to his second cousin, Philippa. But it's Philip VI, his first cousin once removed, who is the king that he's fighting against. And so these are the 2 that are fighting over control of the throne. Okay, so now that you've got all that sorted out, let's go ahead and dive into today's episode.
Okay, we gotta pull back on the... Oh, hi, everyone. Welcome once again to the Extra History of England. Zoe and I were just about to test the distances of the bow weapons David told us about in the last episode. You sure this is safe, Zoe?
What the heck, you two?
I'm so sorry, David. But without further ado, everybody, here's David Crowther of the History of England podcast. Seriously, though, which one of those went farther? Oh, take it away, David!
So he talks about the arrows there, and there's some discussion about that in the last episode about how medieval longbows could do against armor. Normal armor, yeah, they could do fairly well. They could pierce that, but well-designed plate armor, which is what most of the noblemen would have had, even at close range, those arrows are not going through. And there's some fantastic videos on YouTube that you can watch about medieval myth busting and things like that. And they show them using the best designed, heaviest arrowhead possible, even at 10 yards away. And it just bounces right off the medieval plate armor. I mean, it just did nothing at all.
At the end of the Battle of Crécy, Edward was finally able to greet the Black Prince, his son. "You are indeed my son. You have proved yourself worthy to rule a land," he said. In the Middle Ages, pillaging and murdering your way across northern France was clearly considered an appropriate father-son bonding opportunity. Edward marched north to besiege the impregnable coastal fortress of Calais. His captain, Walter Manny, escaped French jail and joined the fight. Edward didn't have the men to capture Paris and the French crown, but Calais was a prize worth fighting for.
And Calais, even when all of the other lands in England or in France are no longer in English possession, for quite a long time after this, at least up through Henry VIII, I know for sure, Calais remains in English hands.
For month after month, Calais resisted and hoped that King Philip would come. They ran out of bread, so they ate the horses. They ran out of horses, so they ate the dogs. In desperation, they expelled 500 of the old and infirm, but in line with the rules of medieval warfare, Edward would not let them come through his lines to escape or feed them. And so there, in sight of their own families, 500 men, women and children starved to death. And then they ran out of dogs. When even the rats looked scrawny, Calais gave up hope. Now, Edward didn't want to slaughter the inhabitants of Calais, but they'd resisted his will, they'd defied him. So Edward prepared a piece of theatre. He sat waiting in a fine pavilion as 6 leading townsmen walked from the gates of Calais to beg for mercy. Gone were their fine clothes and jewellery. They were barefoot in rags with ropes round their neck.
And so you have to wonder what's going on with King Philip and his army at this point. They're obviously not marching out to try and bring relief to the city of Calais. And so these folks watched all of their loved ones, the elderly and the infirmed, die, basically for no reason, because they ended up having to surrender anyway. They must have thought that the king was going to come to their aid and relieve the siege, but he didn't.
They threw themselves at Edward's feet and begged for their lives and the lives of their fellow citizens. But Edward would not be moved. All must die. But then his own queen, Philippa, threw herself at her husband's feet in tears and begged for their lives. And finally, Edward relented.
And remember, as we talked about, Philippa is the niece of the King of France. And she's also a second cousin to Edward, who is part French himself. So she's obviously pleading on behalf of people in a nation where she grew up.
Here was the role of the medieval queen, to intervene so that the king could show mercy or generosity without losing face or appearing weak. England would keep Calais for 200 years, and it would be described by the French as a dagger aimed at the heart of France. Edward went home victorious to England and proceeded to party, big time. But while he parted, England received a tiny visitor, a bacterium called Yesenia Pestis, which had travelled all the way from the Russian steppes.
Here it comes.
Yesenia lived in the guts of a flea. The flea lived on the black rat. The black rat loved the thatch and wooden beams of medieval houses and travelled the seas in merchant ships. Yesenia was not friendly. In fact, Yesenia was utterly lethal. When an infected flea bit a human, Yesenia spread into the human's lymph nodes and destroyed the immune system.
Now, there have been some recent scientific research into all of this, and there is a small but growing number of people who argue that it was not, in fact, spread by the fleas that were hiding on rats, that it was something else that caused it. I don't remember what, but I'll have to look it up and find out for you. So I looked it up a little bit, and it's not actually clear what started it. It may have still come from the fleas on rats, but what they're arguing is that the speed at which it spread could only have been possible if it was from human to human contact and not merely from the bites from fleas on rats. So you can look that up and read about that for yourself, but there's some evidence that that may be the case.
As the body struggled to survive, obscene black buboes burst from under the skin, and so it would become known as the Black Death. Its speed was horrific. You might feel fine in the morning, a bit peaky at lunchtime, and be as dead as a nail by tea time. 45% of Englishmen and English women died. England's population plummeted to 2 million. Europe's population fell by between 30 and 50%.
Now imagine what that does to every aspect of life, what it does to the economy. I mean, just for England alone, think about it, how much of their trade came because of the wool trade and the export of wool. Well, if you've suddenly got half as many people who are farmers in the country, you're not producing the wool you once did. So now your country's bringing in half the revenue that it once did. You've got half as many people working the fields. All of this, just beyond the psychological effect that it had. Just think about the economic impact of losing this many people. It took multiple generations to just get back to where they were.
And the impact of the Black Death was profound and long-lived. Prices fell. Suddenly there were no labourers around, so lowly, wage-earning peasants had more power and freedom than they'd ever had. A lower population meant less men and material for war. Medieval man had no way to understand what had just happened to it, either economically or biologically. For them, this could only be the will of God.
Yep.
Edward decided that it was his duty to carry on as before. Medieval society was deeply conservative. It was the job of a king to protect his people, to make war, to enrich his followers and raise the reputation of his kingdom by celebrating his magnificence. Edward was good at glory. It was a personal talent. In 1352, he famously created the Knights of the Garter, a chivalric order of 24 knights that still exists today.
Yeah, and so Prince William, who's the Duke of Cambridge, I believe was the 1,000th member of the Order of the Garter, and this Order of the Garter goes back to Edward III. You go to the chapel at Windsor Castle. I think is it called St. George's Chapel, and that's where they have all of these symbols throughout the castle at Windsor. They have all of these symbols of the Order of the Garter, and they've got displays for every one of the 1,000 members who have become a part of the Order of the Garter.
Its patron saint was St. George, and in time the saint and his red cross would be the patron saint of all England. Meanwhile in France, the war became almost a private war. English captains raised companies of fighting men, archers, men-at-arms, pikemen, and went to France to win their fortune. These companies of men were called the Free Companies, and France was swamped by English free companies. So when Philip died and his son John became king, optimism swept across France. Handsome and brave, the new king was called John le Bel. Surely he would crush the English. John even created his own order of chivalry, the Order of the Star, to rival Edward's Order of the Garter. A little more dignified than a piece of underwear. Edward's son and heir, the Black Prince, had other ideas. In 1355, he set out on what became known to history as the Great Chevauchée.
And somebody asked me yesterday about the nickname, the Black Prince, where that came from. So let's talk about that for a second while we're on the subject. The first reference to Prince Edward being called the Black Prince actually comes about 150 years after his death. So it's not 100% known for sure whether or not he was called that during his lifetime, since we don't have any contemporary sources that use that term. As for where he got the name, it's most likely because of the way that he led his armies in France and the devastation that he brought upon that country. I would say it's about 90% that's what it was. Some people say it's because he wore black armor, but again, there's no real contemporary sources that ever refer to him wearing black armor. So it's probably just because of the kind of person he was and the way he brought his wrath upon the nation of France.
Burning and pillaging through southern France, seemingly at will, unstoppable, with utter brutality, death and disease trailing in his wake. John le Bel's reputation already lay in ruins, and in the next campaigning season he would have to fight. And so in 1356, the English planned a grand campaign. Henry of Lancaster would invade from the north of France and strike south. The Black Prince and the Captal de Buch would march from Gascony northwards to meet him. But this time, King John trumped them both. He appeared with an army that dwarfed either Lancaster or the Black Prince and cut them off from each other. Now at this point, the Black Prince made like brave Sir Robin and bravely turned his tail and fled. But near the
you can always appreciate a good Monty Python reference, and that's one of my favorite parts of Monty Python and the Holy Grail is the song about brave Sir Robin who rode forth from Camelot. When danger reared its ugly head, he bravely turned his tail and fled. So that's what happened here.
town of Poitiers, out of food, out of water, he was caught. If John had just waited, the English may have had to surrender. They were hungry, tired and thirsty, and miles from the nearest pizza delivery area. But if it was arrogance that made Philip fight at Crécy, John had no choice. For the future of his kingship, he needed to make these English bandits pay, and with double their numbers, a complete victory seemed assured. The French had learned lessons from Crécy. At Poitiers, their main attack was on foot. Hand to hand, the opposing knights hacked at each other, and slowly the smaller English army was forced back, and they were in danger of annihilation. But the Black Prince was his father's son. When all around was chaos, he found a small mounted force under the Captal de Buch and sent them to swing wide round the battlefield and appear in John's rear. And then over the screams and din of battle, he gathered some men together, told them to mount, and cried, "Advance in the name of God and St. George!" The French were shattered into pieces, to small, isolated groups of men, and the slaughter began. The slaughter was not for knights and nobles. No self-respecting soldier in the Middle Ages would be daft enough to kill a knight. The common soldiers and archers fine, no one cared about them, their job was to die. But killing a knight was against the rules of chivalry and good finance. Rather, you took the knight captive, the knight promised to honour any agreement and not to run away, you agreed a ransom, and then he was sent off to collect it for you. Simple as that. Throughout the 100 Years' War, the French and English nobility remained friends. They took part in tournaments, exchanged gifts, shared poetry, and married. War was a game in which the death of a noble was to be deeply regretted.
But the death of a common soldier was, well, that's the way it goes. It just gives you a little bit of a glimpse into the mindset of the time period during feudalism, where the only people who really mattered were the nobles. And everyone else was just property to be exchanged, to be used to gain more, just to be used at the pleasure of the Lord.
And in the crush and chaos at Poitiers, there was one pair that everyone made sure not to kill. A knight in magnificent armour with his 14-year-old son at his side. The father was John le Bel, King of France. The boy was Philip, one day to be Duke of Burgundy. And amazingly, the English had captured the King of France himself. Within a few months, the captured king was the guest of honour at a season of tournaments and pageants in London, bedecked with flags and colour as England celebrated his humiliation. The following years ahead were some of the worst in French history. The medieval state could hardly function without a king, and France collapsed. English free companies descended like locusts on her corpse and feasted, burning, stealing, raping. Here is just one quote by a Frenchman. "The loss by fire of my village where I was born is to be wept for. The vines in this region were not pruned or kept from rotting. The fields were not sown or ploughed. There were no cattle or fowl in the field. No lambs or calves bleated after their mothers. The pleasant sound of bells was heard, not as a summons to divine worship, but as a warning of hostile intentions." And so John agreed to a treaty. He had no choice. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 gave away most of southwestern France and a massive king's ransom. France was on the edge, but that ransom was never paid, for John died in captivity in 1364, and the tide was about to turn.
So, I mean, there's still a long way to go in all of these wars, and things are about as good as they're going to get for Edward III. And in the midst of all of this, remember, you still have had the plague that has wiped out between a third and one half of the people of Europe. So a lot going on. It's a fascinating period in history. It's one I encourage you to study more about. But we'll be back tomorrow with the next episode. I hope you guys have an awesome weekend. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.